Pleased to introduce to you the next speaker. This is Professor Itamar Kislev. Again, actually, in Haifa, I don't have to introduce you, Itamar. Why should I? But I do it anyway. No, keep your seat. It's a pleasure to introduce you. It's always lovely to introduce you. You know, Itamar Kislev is Professor of Hebrew Bible and Medieval Jewish Exegesis here at the University at Haifa. He made his PhD in Jerusalem, so he learned in Jerusalem and published a book on the threshold of the promised land, which was published in Hebrew 2013. Itamar, I mean, you in Haifa know that. Maybe other people don't know that. Itamar is not talking about what he is working on. He is hiding somehow himself all the time and also his work. And I know this is exactly, but he once told me something which I found very impressive. He said to me, look, I don't like these big views of Pentateuchal debates, sources, which you certainly learned in Jerusalem. So don't tell the Jerusalem people with the sources and these big views and so on. I start with some details and a question, and then look whether or not there is a view, a bigger view of that. And I think this is a very sympathetic methodology, and I'm convinced that he will do that in our talk as well. You know, he is a specialist on the Pentateuch, on numbers especially, and is writing a commentary on numbers, writing a lot on numbers, and we are very much looking forward to your talk about the eternal light in the Pentateuch. Please, Itamar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rainer. Achaemenid Persia left its mark on the Hebrew Bible in manifold ways. Here I focus on the question of whether and how the Persian Zoroastrian fire cult impacted the Bible. This paper identifies 6 late interpolations into the priestly writings in the Pentateuch that provide evidence of an effort to insert the Zoroastrian concept of ever-burning fire into the Israelite priestly cult. Even a brief consideration of the status of fire in the Persian religion demonstrates the central status of fire in the Persian cult. As summed up by Mary Boyce, the ancient Iranian cosmogonists regarded fire moreover as the 7th creation, forming the life force, as it were, within the other 6, and so animating the world. Fire was thus of great theoretical, ethical, ritual, and practical importance in ancient Iranian life and thought. Zoroaster developed the cultural inheritance yet further when he apprehended fire as the creation of Asha Vaishta, the best truth. Actually, fire already has an important place in all their Israelite beliefs and religion, as reflected in biblical sources predating the Persian period. Fire is sometimes an aspect of Yahweh's theophanies. I note, for example, the burning bush, where the messenger of Yahweh, or Yahweh himself, appeared in the fire. And the theophany at Horeb, where Yahweh speaks out of the fire. Pillars of cloud and fire accompanied the Israelites during their wandering in the wilderness. The connection between Yahweh and fire thus made the Israelite religion a convenient platform for absorbing aspects of the Persian concept of fire. In his article about pants in the priestly source, David Sperling has shown that the noun michnasayim, trousers, which appear only 5 times in the Hebrew Bible and only in the context of the priestly vestments, has Persian roots. At the end of the paper, he comments, "It behooves us to call attention to other elements in the P source that invite further study against an Iranian backdrop. he briefly considers 3 examples in order to illustrate possible Zoroastrian influence on the priestly writings, one of which is the influence of the Zoroastrian fire cult on the perpetual fire commandment in Leviticus 6. Although correct, his short comment was ignored. Moreover, Sperling neither develops his insight nor analyzes the relevant passage in Leviticus 6, leaving room for further study of this issue. One aspect that requires consideration is the question of dating. Notwithstanding the strong scholarly tendency to date the entire body of the priestly writings in the Torah as late as the Persian period, this is, in my opinion, not necessarily the case with respect to all priestly texts, and more evidence is required in order to date a priestly element to the Persian era. I therefore confine the discussion to late additions to the priestly source in an attempt to demonstrate the existence of a thin priestly editorial layer relating to the altar fire that shares affinity to the Persian fire cult and its concept. The directive regarding perpetual fire in Leviticus 6, 5, and 6 is found in a passage that focuses on another topic. The passage reads as follows: זאת תורת העולה, היא העולה על מוקדה למזבח כל הלילה עד הבוקר, ואש המזבח תוקד בו. ולבש הכהן מידו בד, ומכנסי בד ילבש על בשרו, והרים את הדשן אשר תאכל האש את העולה על המזבח, ושמו אצל המזבח. ופשט את בגדיו ולבש בגדים אחרים, והוציא את הדשן אל מחוץ למחנה אל מקום טהור. והאש על המזבח תוקד בו, לא תכבה, ובאר עליה הכהן עצים בבוקר, וערך עליה העולה, והקטיר עליה חלבי השלמים, אש תמיד תוקד על המזבח, לא תכבה. This is the instruction of the burnt offering that remains on its house upon the altar all night until morning, while the fire on the altar burns it. The priest shall dress in linen raiment with linen trousers next to his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar and place them beside the altar. He shall then take off his vestments and put on other vestments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a pure place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning, not to go out. Every morning the priest shall feed wood to it, lay out the burnt offering on it, and turn into smoke the fat parts of the offerings of well-being. A perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar, not to go out. Although this is the sole occurrence of the ever-burning fire directive in the priestly writings and in the Hebrew Bible in general, the perpetual fire instruction appears in this pericope only in passing. Ostensibly, the burnt offering is the main topic of the passage, at least according to its heading. Zot Torat HaOlah, this is the instruction of the burnt offering. But the passage actually treats the ashes remaining on the altar in the morning after the offerings have been burnt at night, whereas the fatty parts from most offerings burn readily and leave little ash. In the case of an olah, a burnt offering, where the entire animal is burnt on the altar, there may well be leftovers. The heading thus relates precisely to this issue. In preparing the altar for the offerings of the new day, the leftovers must be removed by the priests. The reader may wonder what prompted the appending of the perpetual fire directive to the burnt offering instruction, and why no independent paragraph was devoted to such a seemingly important topic. No clear answer to these questions emerged from the verses, and it appears that two unrelated issues were juxtaposed in one passage. Another consideration should be taken into account here. At the beginning of the sacrificial legislation in Leviticus 1:7, in a pericope that deals with the burnt offering, we find an instruction to light a fire when sacrificing the burnt offering. ונתנו בני אהרון הכהן אש על המזבח וערכו עצים על האש. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and lay out wood upon the fire. Presumably, this reflects an underlying assumption that the fire may be extinguished. It is therefore necessary for the priests to relight and stoke the fire when they sacrifice a new burnt offering. This contradicts the instruction in Leviticus 6:5 and 6 regarding the ever-burning fire on the altar, which obviates any need to relight the fire. Actually, in the paragraph in Leviticus 6:1-4 itself, saying that after the fire burned the sacrifices at night, the priest removed the leftovers in the morning in order to make room for the new day's sacrifices, there is no indication that the priest leaves something burning on the altar, nor is there a warning not to put out the fire while removing the leftovers. The fire may go out during the night, or perhaps the priest himself may douse the fire on the altar while removing the leftovers. This one-time directive of ever-burning fire is connected neither to the previous verses nor to the main topic of the pericope, and nevertheless it does not constitute an independent paragraph, but was attached to an unrelated passage. The verses not only contradict the instruction to light the altar fire in Leviticus 1:7, they probably also reflect a concept that differs from the passage in which they appear. This suggests that the verses that command perpetual fire in Leviticus 6:5 and 6 are late additions to the passage. In the verses, the interpolator twice quoted an expression from verse 2, namely from the original passage. ואש המזבח תוקד בו, the fire of the altar burns it, and twice added the essential element of the new directive, לא תכבה, not to go out. This duplication not only intensifies the concept of perpetual fire, but also creates a structured two-verse unit with a similar opening and closing. The original meaning of the expression ואש המזבח תוקד בו in verse 2 is, however, that the altar fire will continue to be lit at night, burning the burnt offering. This is not a command. The verse describes the situation of the altar in the morning. The altar fire burned the sacrifices at night, and the leftovers need to be removed. The command begins only in verse 3. Accordingly, the meaning of the verb to cut in this case is not that the fire continues to burn overnight, but that it continues to burn the sacrifices at night. In the second use of the expression, ואש המזבח תוקד בו, in verse 6, where it is paraphrased, אש תמיד תוקד על המזבח לא תכבה, a perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar not to go out, the interpolators coined the term אש תמיד, a perpetual fire, thereby underscoring their new notion. Leviticus 6:5 and 6 is a small unit of two verses which was added to the passage about removing sacrificial leftovers from the altar, which is itself not part of the basic layer of the priestly offering law. As many scholars have observed, chapters 6 and 7 are a supplement to the core of the priestly sacrificial legislation in Leviticus 1-5. A second consideration for dating the passage is the occurrence of the aforementioned noun, מכנסיים, in verse 3, which, as Perling has shown, has Persian roots. This leads to the conclusion that as an addition to a not early priestly passage, these two verses were probably composed later in the Persian period. Accordingly, we must ask what underlies the invention of perpetual fire. Why did the interpolators change the previous legislative procedure relating to fire? Does it not seem likely that these verses were composed due to Persian influence? This discussion leads to an inquiry about the underlying concept behind the notion of perpetual fire. What is the importance of this fire? What are its origins? It seems that Milgrom is correct in saying that the fire which is not allowed to die out is that which came forth from Yahweh at the end of the inauguration of the tabernacle in Leviticus 9:24. As divine fire, the idea underlying the directive to keep the altar fire going is clear. However, the description of the appearance of the fire on the 8th day of the inauguration has puzzling aspects. First of all, the relationship between the appearance of Kvod Adonai, the glory of Yahweh in verse 23, and the appearance of the fire in verse 24 is not clear. The verses state, ויבוא משה ואהרון אל אוהל מועד, ויצאו ויברכו את העם, וירא כבוד אדוני אל כל העם, ותצא אש מלפני אדוני, ותאכל על המזבח את העולה ואת החלבים, וירא כל העם, וירונו ויפלו על פניהם. Moses and Aaron then went inside the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people. Fire came forth from before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts on the altar. And all the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. It is not clear if the verses describe a one or two theophanies. The question is heightened when one considers verse 6 at the beginning of the chapter, where Moses says, זה הדבר אשר ציווה אדוני תעשו וירא עליכם כבוד אדוני. This is what Yahweh has commanded that you do, that the glory of Yahweh may appear to you. Here, Moses makes no mention of fire, but only of the glory of Yahweh, and the Israelites and the readers do not expect something else. From the reader's perspective, the appearance of Yahweh's glory is the goal, the climax, and the end of the 8th day. Nothing else is necessary. Moreover, throughout the story, the priests make offerings, and regarding all of them, it is stated that Aaron turned them into smoke on the altar, vayakter. The reader wonders if divine fire is so important for the cult that it should not be allowed to go out. How was it possible to offer sacrifices on a non-divine fire at the inauguration of the tabernacle? And if the divine fire was supposed to appear shortly, why turn that day's offerings into smoke before its appearance? Note that the divine fire does consume the offerings on the altar as stated in verse 24, which were already turned into smoke. All these comments provide a solid basis for suspicion that the appearance of the fire, which is described in 9:24a, is a secondary edition, as some scholars following Willem de Wette correctly observed. The basic story thus contains no divine fire and probably assumes use of human fire, namely fire lighted by human beings. The short edition, however, inserted divine fire into the narrative. The basic story is consistent with the basic stratum of Leviticus 1-7, in which priests light the fire, presumably every morning anew, for the first offering and after cleaning the altar of the previous day's leftovers. As mentioned, the appearance of the divine fire is probably an integral aspect of the concept of the ever-burning fire. If we postulated that the notion of perpetual fire develops through Persian influence, then it may also be the case for the appearance of the divine cultic fire in Leviticus 9:24a. We know of the idea about the beginning of Persian sacred fires only from late texts. Some Pahlavi texts recount that during creation, Ahura Mazda installed the 3 sacred fires of the highest grade in their places. Perhaps in this case, the priestly text can serve as indirect evidence for the antiquity of the Persian view regarding a divine source for the sacred fire. Another text that probably belongs to this late priestly reduction is found in the story of Nadab and Abihu. Immediately after the termination of the inauguration of the tabernacle at the end of chapter 9, we are told at the beginning of chapter 10 of the death of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's elder sons. ויקחו בני אהרון נדב ואביהו איש מחתתו ויתנו בהן אש וישימו עליה קטורת ויקריבו לפני אדוני אש זרה אשר לא ציווה אותם. Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and offered before Yahweh a lion fire which he had not commanded them. Many explanations have been suggested for the nature of Nadab's and Abihu's transgression, which is described in this verse. Prima facie, the account is clear, because the verse states explicitly that they brought esh zara, alien fire, namely fire not taken from the divine fire on the altar. In observing, however, that as formulated the verse is difficult, scholars note the incongruous location of the phrase "esh zara asher lo tziva otam," alien fire which he had not commanded them, saying that it should have come not at the end of the verse but earlier, closer to the reference to fire at the beginning of the verse. It would look better if worded like this: ויקחו בני אהרון נדב ואביהו איש מחתתו ויתנו בהן אש זרה אשר לא ציווה אותם וישימו עליה קטורת ויקריבו לפני אדוני. Now Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, each took his fire pan, put in it alien fire which he had not commanded them, laid incense on it, and offered before Yahweh. Accordingly, it seems reasonable to assume that the entire phrase is secondary and was added in order to change the nature of the transgression, which now involves alien fire. It appears that initially a different transgression was meant, probably approaching too near to Yahweh. In its current version, the verb that describes the transgression is vayakrivu, they offered, but in the original verse the verb was vocalized with a slight difference. Vayikrevu, they approached. Nadab and Abihu left no traces in the priestly genealogies, and this short story explains why. It is interesting to note that in the non-priestly tradition in Exodus 24:9-11, Nadab and Abihu were part of the group that saw the God of Israel, but remained unharmed. It seems that the priestly story used and revoked this non-priestly tradition or a similar one in order to remove Nadab and Abihu from the priestly genealogy. In the priestly version, they were not saved, but died for coming too close to the deity. The interpolators who added the phrase "esh zara asher lo tziva otam," alien fire which he had not commanded them, made the transgression an exemplar for those who do not use the divine fire for the cult. This addition demonstrates the very dangerous, potentially deadly use of alien fire. The expression esh zara here conveys an idea quite opposite to that of esh tamid. In Leviticus 6:6, both expressions were coined by the school that heightens the importance of fire in the Israelite cult. The divine reaction to Nadab and Abihu's deed is described in verse 2. ותצא אש מלפני אדוני ותאכל אותם וימותו לפני אדוני. And fire came forth from Yahweh and consumed them. Thus they died before Yahweh. Making use of this dreadful reaction, the interpolators duplicated the initial part of this reaction in the original story, inserting it also at the end of the inauguration of the tabernacle a few verses earlier. A sophisticated means of creating divine fire on the altar. At first, in its original appearance, the divine fire was an eruptive, dangerous fire activated only within the tabernacle. It was Nadab and Abihu's encroachment on the fiery deity that caused their death by burning. The new appearance of the divine fire differs totally. This fire appears on the outer altar and is integrated in the context as a sign of Yahweh's satisfaction with the tabernacle. Attention should also be paid to the other references to the death of Aaron's elder sons, mentioned 3 more times in the Pentateuch. As I will discuss the reference in Leviticus 16 at greater length in the next part of my lecture, I briefly discuss now the other 2, Numbers 3:4 and 26:61, both of which mention the offering of alien fire. The reference in Numbers 3:4 reads as follows: ויעמוד נדב ואביהו לפני אדוני בהקריבם אש זרה לפני אדוני. But Nadab and Abihu died before Yahweh when they offered alien fire before Yahweh. This reference reflects the current form of Leviticus 10:1. This passage is part of the arrangement of the camp as recounted in Numbers 1-4. Elsewhere, I argued that in their current form, Numbers 1 and 2 represent a second stage from the Persian period, and we can assume that their continuation in chapters 3 and 4 also dates to that period. Moreover, because the passage that refers to the death of Nadab and Abihu is somewhat exceptional, some scholars maintain its lateness as compared to its context. The second reference in Numbers 26:61 resembles the first and also reflects the current form of Leviticus 10:1. וימות נדב ואביהו בהקריבם אש זרה לפני אדוני. But Nadab and Abihu died when they offered alien fire before Yahweh. Elsewhere I showed that this chapter was composed in the Persian period and has great affinity to the composition of Numbers 1 and 2. And I claim that the verse about Nadab and Abihu occurs at the end of a long edition. Although this edition may belong to the composers themselves, it seems more likely that this edition is not unified and that the reference to the death of Nadab and Abihu is even later. As both references are very late, it is therefore not surprising that they reflect Leviticus 10:1 in its current form. And now to Leviticus 16. This chapter treats the ritual performed by the high priest that enables him to enter the adytum. Because of this action's inherent danger, the high priest must follow a strict protocol as stated, ואל יבוא בחולת אל הקודש ולא ימות, בזאת יבוא אהרון אל הקודש. He is not to come at will into the shrine, lest he die. Thus only shall Aaron enter the shrine. The opening of the chapter refers to the death of Nadab ben Nabayu. וידבר אדוני אל משה אחרי מות שני בני אהרון בקרבתם לפני אדוני וימותו. Yahweh spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they drew too close before Yahweh. Although this opening may be secondary, some scholars suggest uniquely it reflects the original form of Leviticus 10:1. The phrase Esh Zara is missing, and the meaning of Karav here is undoubtedly to approach. Moreover, the notion that in its original form the transgression of Aaron's elder sons was encroaching on Yahweh conforms to the topic of Leviticus 16, which concerns entering the Aditum. Accordingly, Leviticus 16:1 provides evidence that the phrase Esh Zara asher lo tziva otam, alien fire which he had not commanded them, is a secondary addition in Leviticus 10:1. Another element of Leviticus 16 that requires examination is verses 12 and 13, which treat the ingress of the high priest to the inner sanctum while carrying incense on a fire pan. This pericope explicitly states that the high priest should take the fire from the altar, ולקח מלוא המחתה גחלי אש מעל המזבח, and he shall take a panful of glowing coals scooped from the altar. Actually, verses 12 and 13 interrupt the sequence between verse 11 and 14, which deal with the slaughtering of the chatat, offering of a bull, and the sprinkling of its blood over the kaporet, respectively. This interruption leads many scholars to rightly conclude that verses 12 and 13 are secondary. In contrast, based on the observation that without these verses, Aaron's entry to the Aditum is not mentioned, Christoph Nihan concludes that verses 12 and 13 are original. The entrance to the inner sanctum is indeed mentioned only in verses 12 and 13, not, however, with reference to the blood of the bull, but the incense. The missing reference to the bull's blood is more conspicuous in comparison to the instruction relating to the goat's blood in verse 15, in which the entry to the Aditum is explicitly mentioned. He shall then slaughter the people's goat of Chatat, bring its blood behind the curtain, and do with its blood as he has done with the blood of the bull. He shall sprinkle it over the kaporet and in front of the kaporet. Accordingly, we can surmise that in an original legislation, the missing detail did appear between the slaughtering in verse 11 and the sprinkling of the blood in the inner sanctum in verse 14. Thus, the instruction in verses 12 and 13 either suppressed the reference to the entrance, or what seems more likely to me, used it. The phrase, והביא מבית לפרוכת, and bring behind the curtain in verse 12, which is similar to the wording in the parallel verse 15, may be a vestige of that ingress, whereas the reference to the object that was brought inside, the blood, was removed. In any event, the missing reference to bringing the blood into the Aditum and the interruption of the sequence by verses 12 and 13 are significant considerations that verses 12 and 13 are a late addition to this passage. The interpolators located their addition at Aaron's first entry into the inner sanctum, granting the incense a unique function. Here, the cloud, anan, of incense covers the kaporet, and the warning, velo yamut, lest he die, at the end of the verse indicates that the danger of death accompanies entry to the Aditum, and that the screening off of the kaporet eliminates the danger. There are clear affinities between verse 13 and verse 2, which states, ואל יבוא בחולת אל הקודש ולא ימות כי בענן אראה על הכפורת. He is not to come at will into the shrine lest he die, for I appear in the cloud over the kaporet. The phrases ענן, כפורת, and ולא ימות are shared by both passages. We can extrapolate on that basis that according to verse 13, the cloud of the incense probably prevents the priest from looking at Yahweh who appears on the kaporet. In this case, the incense has a unique function. Here, the function is not apotropaic, as in number 17, 6 to 15, which will be discussed later, but rather to create a physical screen that blocks the field of view. It should be noted that verse 2 does not state that there is a need to prevent seeing Yahweh. The verse just states that because of the presence of the divine in the editum, a ceremony is required in order to enable Aaron to enter it without dying. It is not the sight of the deity that is dangerous, but the divine presence itself. The interpolations in verses 12 and 13, however, interpret verse 2 differently. Instead of, for I appear in the cloud over the kaporet, the interpolators granted the phrase a new meaning. Only by means of the cloud of the incense, I shall appear over the kaporet. Reading the clause, ki be'anan ere'eh al kaporet in verse 2, the interpolators perhaps recall the account in Ezekiel 8:11, and the phrase, ve'atar anan haktoret oleh, and the thick cloud of incense smoke ascended there, and added verses 12 and 13, which reinterpret verse 2, creating a unique function for the incense, producing a smoke screen. This is further evidence that verses 12 and 13 are a secondary addition. In any event, the instruction to take the fire from the altar, which is consistent with the notion of ever-burning fire, appears in that addition to Leviticus 16. Perhaps the reference to the story of Nadab and Abihu in verse 1 triggered sensitivity to that issue, prompting a need to clarify that in this case, the fire comes from the altar. Offering incense on fire pans appears twice in the book of Numbers. In the story of Korah in number 16, and in the story of the plague that appears as its continuation in number 17, 6 to 15. In the first, offering incense is mentioned in relation to the contest between Aaron and the 250 chieftains. But the source of the fire is not explicitly specified, creating the impression that its source is unimportant. In the second story, however, Moses specifically commands Aaron to take the fire for the incense from the altar. ויאמר משה אל אהרון, קח את המחתה ותן עליה אש מעל המזבח. Then Moses said to Aaron, take the fire pan and put on it fire from the altar and add incense. This difference between adjacent and seemingly connected stories requires explanation. As it emerged from the story, the death by divine fire of the 250 chieftains who offered incense on fire pans is not their use of fire from a source other than the altar, but rather the divine choice of Aaron over the chieftains. Furthermore, it is unlikely that Moses would deliberately entrap the chieftains by not ordering them to take fire from the altar. This means that the story in Numbers 16 was simply unaware of the phrase אש זרה אשר לא ציווה אותם, which was interpolated into Leviticus 10. Number 17 present a different picture. In order to terminate the plague, Moses commands Aaron to take fire from the altar and burn incense. Many scholars consider this short story, number 17, 6-15, a direct continuation of the priestly thread in chapter 16. This is problematic because, as mentioned, the priestly story, number 16, is unaware of the clause regarding alien fire in Leviticus 10:1, and accordingly does not demand that the fire be brought from the altar, whereas 17:11 emphasizes in Moses' order that the fire should be taken from the altar. Regardless, maybe I skip. Okay. Although there is no textual evidence in the verses, it is tempting to assume that the words "me'al hamizbeach" from the altar in verse 11 are secondary, inserted either by the composer who connected the story or by the later glossator in accordance with the idea of perpetual fire. It seems a reasonable assumption that a composer or the glossator did not want to add these words to chapter 16 in relation to the burning of incense by the chieftains. Namely, they did not seek to imply that unauthorized persons took fire from the altar for burning the incense. But with regard to Aaron the priest in 17:11, they sought to demonstrate the correct way to use incense. In order to reinforce this conjecture, another element must be discussed. With regard to number 17:2, there is a difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. Okay, I will go to the conclusion. We can conclude, therefore, that in this case, the Septuagint reflects the original formulation. This then raises the following question. Okay. This conclusion lends slight support to the previous conjecture that the words "me'al hamizbeach" in 17:11 are secondary too. In the current form of the text in chapter 17, the issue of alien fire versus fire from the altar appears. The accusation that the chieftain transgressed by offering alien fire in verse 2 is connected to the injunction to Aaron by Moses to take fire from the altar in verse 11. The chieftain's transgression of verse 2 may have sparked the need for clarification that Aaron did it properly in verse 11 or vice versa. Both editions are inserted in order to demonstrate the notion of cultic fire. To sum up, the discussion noted 6 interpolations of different levels of certainty. The first is the instruction to maintain a perpetual fire on the altar in Leviticus 6, 5-6, which was joined secondarily to the directive regarding treatment of the leftovers from the burnt offering. The second is the description of the fire that came from Yahweh and burnt the offerings on the altar at the end of the inauguration of the tabernacle in Leviticus 9:24a. This addition, which transforms the altar's fire into divine fire, constitutes the rationale for maintaining an ever-burning fire. The third addition is the clause, "Esh zara asher lo tziva otam," alien fire which he had not commanded them, which was inserted into the account of the transgression of Aaron's elder sons in Leviticus 10:1. According to this gloss, Nadab and Abihu died because they used alien fire, not divine fire from the altar. This is an effective warning against independent lighting of cultic fire. The fourth interpolation appears in Leviticus 16, verses 12 and 13, in which there is an injunction to Aaron to take the fire from the altar for the incense offering. The fifth and sixth are in number 17. The fifth inserts an accusation of offering alien fire into the passage about the chieftain's fire pans in verse 2. The sixth inserts the words Me'al HaMizbeach in the command to Aaron regarding the fire to be used to burn the incense in verse 11. All these interpolations, which were introduced in the Persian period, probably represent an effort to insert the Zoroastrian concept of divine cultic ever-burning fire into the Israelite priestly cult. Their insertion probably took place very late in the Persian period, as some were interpolated into passages themselves dating to the Persian period. This is consistent with the assumed dating of the development of the Achaemenid fire temples. This by no means represents a dramatic change to the priestly Israelite cult, and the altar did not become a real fire altar. The main change is that fire itself became an independent cultic object. As we have seen, this receives only limited expression in the Torah. In the later Second Temple period, however, this increasingly came to fore. Here I only briefly mention, for instance, the term Korban Ha'etzim, the wood offering, which appears in the book of Nehemiah, and which I plan to treat on a different occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Itamar, for the wonderful presentation. And maybe these six insertions you showed us are the main reason for the Reichsautorisation of the Persians. Because they saw these six insertions and said, well, that's our Torah. Maybe. Now we have time for questions.
Thank you very much. I found this very interesting and plausible, and my question pertains particularly to the first 2 points. In your conclusion, you, to a certain degree, somehow were very modest in assessing the changes that these insertions might signify for the ideology of the priestly document. But particularly number 2, I think, is there not a major transformation going on, particularly somehow for the very first sacrifice in the history of the sacrifices? Because usually somehow, according to the priestly document, is a sacrifice is being brought to God, then yeah, it's being burned, and the smoke reaches then God, and God takes it up. But here in Numbers 2, actually the main direction is 180 degrees the opposite. So God himself sends the fire. So I was wondering whether this is not a major theological transformation of the priestly code, that apparently whoever inserted Leviticus 9:24a wanted really to stress this is a divine institution. It's not just something that the humans do, and this is visible from the very first event of the sacrifice. So my question would simply be: is it not at least somehow, at some points, a major transformation that is taking here place for people?
I can say that this is a question of evaluation of the change, yeah. But moreover, the number 2 is only one-time event in the at the beginning of the cult, in the beginning of the sacrifice offerings on the altar. And I think that the change is only of the perception, the concept of the fire, not the way the God accept the sacrifices. But maybe you're right, this is more than I present.
Professor Banania. another one before? Yeah, very short.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you, because it gives the opportunity to look for what happened between Iranians and Jews in the Persian period. I think that what you said is, from our point of view, plausible. It will be very useful to have a more, in your final presentation, a space dedicated to the role of the fire within the ritual, because our consideration on the importance of the fire in the Zoroastrian or Mazdian tradition is connected with a special liturgical framework. So it plays, of course, it is unquenchable, but when the fire is activated, it takes part, it's the central point of a ritual. So it is like the axis mundi in the ritual chamber. So it will be useful to understand if there is a comparative is there a comparative performative dimension, which this will be an additional element in the comparison. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. The paper this morning said that the one difference that we can see here between the Judahite cult and the fire cult in Zoroastrianism is there's no Olah there.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So is some of the theology that was being talked about, is this an attempt to put something that might have been objectionable to the Zoroastrians, to make the claim that it's a divinely wanted thing or something? Because this is the one thing that would not be very Zoroastrian.
You're right, but I presented that the priestly cult didn't change in that way. So the burnt offering remained the main sacrifice in the priestly cult. Remain. Not, I don't think this is an objection to the, but remain, I don't know, but I think that they didn't want to change their cult all the way to the Persian concept, the Persian cult.
I found it a fascinating presentation, really very detailed, of course, which was good. I wonder, though, the notion of the strange fire, Eish Zara. It seems to me that the background there is that God alights his own fire. He kindles his own fire, and he is not dependent on human beings for kindling his fire. And this is a theme that you also have on Mount Horeb, the God who answers with fire. Is it the Gideon story where the angel, well, that is God, also burns the or sets fire to the altar, and that the notion of an Eish Tamid is actually subservient to this notion of the fire of God Himself. Mm-hmm. So that because it has to be Tamid, because that is the fire that God has lighted, mm-hmm. and therefore you always have to use that. And only in cases where you are outside the temple, you find examples where God answers with fire and sets the...
I don't understand the question.
Well, if you say this is Zoroastrian ideology that enters into the Hebrew Bible, I wonder if that's true. Because I do not know, but there are people here to enlighten us on that respect, mm-hmm. whether the notion of a strange fire, which seems to me the crucial element here, strange fire as opposed to the fire lighted by God Himself, which, by the way, then is eternal or perpetual, But a strange fire does not strike me as a very Zoroastrian notion.
Ah, okay. Actually, I don't know, but what I read is that the Zoroastrians have a strict protocol for lighting or moving the fire. So it seems to me very similar to the concept of Esh Dara. I don't know. Yeah? Late, of course.
No, but it's alien because it comes from another side. So this is alien. So the problem is that it is a fire of strangers. So it is a fire of somebody else. So what does it mean, alien? To whom it refers, the adjective? Who is alien? Who is the?
No, the fire is alien.
Well, because it was a kind of fire, probably enlightened or treated from a different tradition, which was their own. So it was something embarrassing, probably, because they were following another tradition. So this seems to point out to somebody else.
Okay.
But
no, I think that alien fire is, as I said, a fire that born by human being. Okay. It's not a divine fire. Yeah.
Another question. I think we have no So thank you very much, Itamar, for this wonderful presentation.